In the cold gloom before dawn at Windsor Castle, the stroke of a fountain pen shattered 30 years of uneasy peace. King Charles III signed the emergency financial freeze, a royal prerogative decree that immediately revoked Earl Spencer's security clearances, stripped his access to crown properties, and banished him from the royal household, effective that very night. Under British constitutional traditions, such an executive order operates with absolute immunity, instantly nullifying decades of diplomatic courtesy without requiring parliamentary review. Within minutes, royal guards moved in to seize and seal the legendary Koh-i-Noor diamond crown under heavy security escort. The sudden confiscation served as a direct declaration of war against the Spencer bloodline. Across the courtyard, inside the darkened map room, Prince William buried his face in his hands, tears slipping silently through his fingers as he listened to the low echoes of boots on marble. For the future king, this was not merely a political maneuver. It was the brutal tearing apart of his mother's sacred legacy by the very institution meant to protect it. Miles away, Earl Spencer stared at his secure tablet in total disbelief as bankers formally notified him that his control over the family trust funds had been completely frozen. The royal veneer of unity had finally ripped open, exposing an unyielding civil war at the heart of the monarchy. Absolute power had drawn its line in the sand, leaving a shattered prince to weep for a family that traded love for absolute control. Was King Charles defending the divine authority of the crown, or was this a ruthless purge designed to crush the Spencer legacy forever? Comment 1 if you stand with the king, or comment 2 if you support the Spencer family. Deep beneath the ancient stone foundations of Windsor Castle, the heavy steel door of the secret archives room slammed shut with a dull, echoing thud. Instantly, ultrasonic signal jammers hummed to life along the reinforced walls, completely severing every cell phone connection, encrypted satellite feed, and radio signal within a 50-foot radius. Outside the iron threshold, elite officers of the Royal Protection Command established an impenetrable security perimeter, ensuring that not a single document, audio recording, or photographic image could leak to the waiting press corps gathered outside the castle gates. The air inside the subterranean chamber grew thick, cold, and suffocating as King Charles III and Queen Camilla presided over the mandatory annual inventory of crown heirlooms. Under British constitutional protocol guidelines established during the reign of King George V, this yearly audit serves as an unalterable state requirement. The law mandates that sacred historic treasures belonging to the sovereign in right of the crown must remain strictly catalogued and legally separated from any personal inheritance or private royal assets. Standing near the center of the vast stone room, Queen Camilla adjusted her silk scarf while 3 senior archivists, wearing white cotton gloves, quietly catalogued rows of velvet boxes containing centuries of British imperial history. The meticulous, rhythmic routine suddenly shattered when the heavy iron latch clicked open once again. Earl Spencer stepped into the room completely unannounced, utilizing his legacy security pass as a former appointed co-trustee of the royal estate. This specific legal classification granted him irrevocable constitutional clearance to access high-security crown vaults, a diplomatic privilege that castle guards had not yet received formal authorization to revoke. In his right hand, the Earl carried a thick leather binder stuffed with notarized land deeds, historical correspondence, and original financial trusts bearing the late Princess Diana's signature. His polished leather shoes clicked with deliberate weight against the cold flagstones, drawing every single eye toward his resolute silhouette. All motion inside the archive room instantly ground to a complete halt. The air turned icy as the Earl's gaze shifted away from the sovereign and locked onto the far corner of a polished mahogany dressing table. There, resting unshielded inside an open velvet display case, lay the legendary platinum tiara housing the massive Koh-i-Noor diamond. The glittering stone, steeped in centuries of colonial conflict, royal intrigue, and complex international diplomacy, sat fully exposed. It had been placed directly alongside Queen Camilla, personal jewelry collection, sitting mere inches from her everyday diamond brooches and private gold necklaces. A terrifying silence fell across the chamber as every royal official present realized that a sacred constitutional red line had just been crossed. Under long-standing statutory regulations governing the Royal Collection Trust, state jewelry containing stones of historical significance cannot be commingled with private personal items or removed from certified vault storage without explicit parliamentary oversight and formal cabinet sign-off. By moving an irreplaceable state treasure of such immense monetary value into a private grooming area without public documentation, the royal household had committed an unprecedented administrative breach. Earl Spencer took 3 slow, deliberate steps toward the table, his knuckles turning chalk white as his fingers tightened around the heavy legal dossier. He locked eyes with Queen Camilla, his voice dropping into a razor-sharp whisper that echoed ominously off the damp stone walls, declaring that the sacred historical legacy of his sister would never be converted into personal property or quietly absorbed into private hands. Across the room, King Charles remained utterly motionless, his right hand hovering just above his golden signet ring as the shadows of the vault deepened around them. The sovereign eyes narrowed, recognizing that this was no longer a simple family quarrel over sentimentality. The presence of the legal binder in the Earl hands meant that the Spencer family had quietly gathered evidence of financial reclassification, preparing to challenge the legal ownership of the late princess' assets before the public could ever suspect a rift. Every official in the room stood frozen, terrified that a single, unexpected word could trigger an immediate constitutional crisis capable of shattering the credibility of the entire institution. Earl Spencer stepped even closer to the mahogany table, placing his heavy legal folder directly beside the velvet case housing the Koh-i-Noor diamond. He slowly unclasped the leather binder, revealing dozens of archived pages marked with official state seals from 30 years prior. These documents contained the original financial covenants drafted during the royal separation of 1996, explicitly stating that certain ceremonial items linked to the Princess of Wales were to remain held in trust for her direct heirs, Prince William and Prince Harry, rather than reverting to the sovereign private control. By showing these papers in the presence of the king, the Earl was delivering a direct legal ultimatum signaling that any attempt to alter the status of these artifacts would meet immediate challenge in the highest courts of the land. The king stood tall, leaning lightly on his solid oak walking stick, his facial expression turning to stone as he surveyed his former brother-in-law. Charles understood the immense political danger of the moment. Under the unwritten British Constitution, the monarch authority rests upon the delicate consent of the governed and the strict adherence to tradition. Should the public discover that historic state treasures were being reshuffled behind locked doors while the Spencer family was being systematically locked out of their ancestral agreements, the resulting uproar would rival the darkest scandals of the 20th century. The silence between the two men stretched for what felt like an eternity, filled only with the low, mechanical hum of the ultrasonic jammers overhead. The confrontation had officially moved far past simple personal bitterness or long-standing family resentment. Inside this soundproof sanctuary buried deep beneath the castle, the hidden power architecture of the modern monarchy faced its deadliest internal reckoning. The unyielding spirit and enduring memory of Princess Diana now stood as an insurmountable barrier between the sovereign and the absolute authority he sought to enforce. Inside the cold subterranean archive, 3 decades of suppressed fury, humiliation, and silent resentment reached a violent boiling point within Earl Spencer. Looking at the glittering diamond tiara resting beside Queen Camilla personal cosmetics, he saw far more than an ancient piece of royal jewelry. To him, that sacred object embodied the painful memory and enduring spirit of his late sister, Princess Diana. For years, the Spencer family had silently endured the subtle, systematic erasure of Diana influence within the royal institution. Seeing her wholly historical legacy dragged out into the dim light of a basement vault, used merely as a political prop to elevate the public standing and royal prestige of the new queen, shattered whatever delicate self-restraint remained in his blood. His heart pounded with raw outrage as he took another aggressive step forward, staring directly past the monarch at the woman sitting before the mahogany table. Without uttering a single word of warning, Earl Spencer lunged forward, sweeping his heavy right forearm across the surface of the dressing table. His arm struck the velvet-lined display case with sudden, devastating force, sending the heavy container tumbling off the edge. The priceless structure crashed violently onto the hard marble floor with a deafening metallic clang that shattered the silence of the chamber like a gunshot. Under long-standing royal legal codifications regarding disputed historical heirlooms, any physical artifact catalogued under the National Heritage Directory that becomes subject to an active ownership conflict must immediately undergo an emergency operational status change. Specifically, royal legal statutes dictate that disputed heritage items must be placed under an absolute administrative freeze, impounded by Crown custodians, and strictly banned from any public or private display by any individual until formal judicial clearance is granted. By forcing the tiara onto the ground in the presence of witnesses, the Earl had deliberately triggered an automatic constitutional freeze, legally stripping the Queen of any right to wear or possess the artifact. The sharp, jarring sound of precious metals scraping against unyielding marble echoed off the stone arches, sending shockwaves through every official standing in the vault. Earl Spencer stood over the fallen tiara, his body shaking with unbridled defiance, his chest heaving as he pointed a trembling finger toward Queen Camilla. He raised his voice, declaring openly in front of the frozen archivists that the Queen lacked the moral standing, the spiritual right, and the constitutional dignity to ever lay her hands upon the sacred relics of Princess Diana. The words hung in the suffocating air, an unprecedented, direct strike against the legitimacy of the consort that cut through the ancient etiquette of the court. Across the room, King Charles III snapped. His face flushed dark red as decades of regal composure disintegrated in a single instant of unadulterated fury. The monarch slammed his heavy fist onto the wooden table with a thunderous boom that rattled the glass cases nearby. He stood up straight, his tall frame towering over the room, leaning his weight against his solid oak walking stick as his knuckle turned bone white. The king drove a piercing, venomous gaze straight into the eyes of his former brother-in-law, a stare filled with the absolute wrath of an absolute sovereign whose authority had been challenged inside his own fortress. Without breaking eye contact with the Earl, Charles barked a low, commanding order to the senior archivists and security guards standing petrified near the perimeter. He commanded every advisor, secretary, and keeper of the collection to clear the room immediately, demanding that not a single soul remain behind to witness what was about to transpire. The palace officials, trembling under the terrifying weight of the king rage, backed out of the chamber in complete panic, dragging their administrative folders and heavy equipment behind them. Within seconds, the heavy iron door swung inward and slammed shut with an absolute, heavy thud, sealing the heavy lock mechanism from the inside. The ultrasonic jammers continued their low, mechanical drone, insulating the chamber from the outside world as the heavy steel threshold closed. All diplomatic protocol had officially expired. All legal posturing had dissolved into raw, primitive conflict. Inside the soundproof darkness of the castle basement, 3 individuals were left standing alone, surrounded by centuries of imperial relics and the shattered remnants of a fallen crown. The thin veil of royal decorum that held the dynasty together had been torn to pieces, initiating a ruthless, life-or-death clash between the fierce honor of the Spencer bloodline and the absolute, unyielding authority of the British Crown. The Earl stood his ground, refusing to lower his eyes or step back, even as the sovereign walked slowly out from behind the mahogany table. The fallen tiara lay motionless between them on the cold marble floor, a physical manifestation of a family legacy torn in half by ambition and grief. Charles took a deep, steadying breath, his jaw set in a rigid line as he closed the distance between himself and his challenger, ignoring the presence of the Queen, who remained seated in silent shock. Every second that passed inside the locked vault stretched the tension to a near unbearable breaking point. For 30 years, both sides had played their roles in a carefully scripted public illusion, exchanging polite smiles at memorial services and signing formal agreements behind closed doors. That era of false peace had expired forever in the span of a single heartbeat. The Earl had risked his liberty, his titles, and his place in society to strike at the heart of the royal establishment, while the King now faced the terrifying reality that his supreme authority could be so openly defied within his own ancestral walls. The silence inside the sealed archive room grew heavier with every passing moment, pregnant with the weight of an impending political earthquake. The struggle for the spirit of Princess Diana memory had finally stripped away all diplomatic camouflage, leaving two powerful men locked in a desperate battle where only one side could emerge victorious and where the casualty would be the very survival of the monarchy itself. Behind the sealed iron door, the soundproof archive room transformed into an unyielding battlefield, where nearly 3 decades of buried hatred, bitter resentment, and unresolved grief exploded without restraint. The polite diplomatic masks worn by the sovereign and the aristocracy dissolved entirely into raw hostility. King Charles III took a deliberate step toward Earl Spencer, pointing an unshakable finger directly at his former brother-in-law. The king accused the Earl of weaponizing the sacred memory of Princess Diana as a despicable political tool to blackmail the court and publicly vilify Queen Camilla before the eyes of history. The monarch voice resonated off the stone walls, declaring that using a dead icon to undermine the stability of the sovereign was an act of rank cowardice that no ruling king could ever tolerate. Earl Spencer did not flinch, his jaw set like iron as he fired back with equal severity. He fiercely accused the king of executing a systematic, cold-blooded campaign to erase every trace of the Spencer family influence from the future bloodline of the throne. The Earl stated that for 30 years, the royal household had quietly reclassified royal assets, quietly removed historical portraits, and systematically stripped away the legacy that belonged by blood to Diana children. Under British constitutional framework, the administration of the royal estate serves as a foundational legal shield designed to protect crown assets from private exploitation and improper conversion. Under long-standing legal traditions governing the realm, any documented violation of these management covenants creates an immediate opening for direct parliamentary intervention, granting politicians the statutory power to audit royal finances and strip administrative control away from the sovereign. By forcing the legal folder onto the table and provoking a confrontation over the tiara, Earl Spencer had deliberately raised the specter of parliamentary interference, threatening to drag the private financial arrangements of the Windsor dynasty before a public tribunal. Across the corridor, inside the darkened map room adjacent to the secret vault, Prince William stood frozen in absolute agony. Listening through the thick stone walls to the muffled, furious shouting of his father and his uncle, the future king buried his face in his hands, tears flowing uncontrollably as he wept in quiet outrage. For William, the unbearable tragedy lay in seeing his late mother's sacred memory degraded into a crude bargaining chip, a political weapon wielded in a ruthless war of egos between two men obsessed with control. Back inside the subterranean vault, King Charles recognized that the time for debate had passed and that supreme executive authority required an immediate, ruthless strike. Refusing to allow the confrontation to stall any longer, the sovereign moved decisively. Leaning his walking stick against the mahogany desk, Charles knelt down, picked up the velvet case containing the Koh-i-Noor tiara from the cold floor, and carried it directly toward the heavy steel wall safe located at the far end of the room. The king manually spun the mechanical combination dial, unlocked the reinforced door, placed the contested masterpiece deep within the dark interior, and slammed the safe door shut with an absolute, heavy thud that sounded like the final verdict of a courtroom. Turning back to face Earl Spencer, King Charles stood tall and issued a devastating royal proclamation on the spot. Utilizing the absolute prerogative powers vested in the crown, the king declared that Earl Spencer was stripped of every remaining royal privilege, every honorary title, every security pass, and every access right to crown estates effective immediately. The sovereign announced that the Earl was hereby banished from the royal household forever, warning him that any further attempt to enter royal properties or challenge the administration of the estate would be met with immediate arrest and prosecution under state treason laws. The Earl stood in silence, his knuckles white, as the reality of the king's immediate strike settled over the room. Charles had effectively cut off the Spencer family from the inner circle of the monarchy, sealing the legal archives and locking away the disputed heritage under royal security protocols that no civil court could easily override. The monarch had drawn a definitive line in the sand, choosing to enforce total sovereign authority over compromise, even if it meant inflicting deep, permanent scars upon his own eldest son. Queen Camilla remained seated in absolute silence, watching as King Charles retrieved his oak walking stick and smoothed down the front of his jacket, his facial expression completely devoid of remorse. The king walked past Earl Spencer without offering another word or a single glance, signaling that the Earl no longer existed within the official record of the court. The sudden, unyielding execution of royal power had brought an end to 30 years of unstable peace, replacing delicate family diplomacy with absolute administrators. Outside the archive door, the heavy mechanical lock clicked open from the inside, allowing the cold corridor air to spill into the heated chamber. Earl Spencer stood alone beside the mahogany table, looking at the empty velvet box that had once held his sister tiara, realizing that the political shield protecting his family access had been completely shattered. The battle over Princess Diana's legacy had reached its most brutal chapter yet, leaving the Spencer family stripped of their historic privileges while the royal institution locked its doors against the outside world. As the king stepped into the corridor, Prince William slowly wiped the tears from his eyes and walked away into the shadows of Windsor Castle, carrying the heavy burden of a fractured dynasty on his shoulders. The unwritten rules that had governed the relationship between the crown and the Spencer family were gone forever, replaced by an iron curtain of royal decree that no diplomacy could ever dismantle. The war for the memory of the princess had not ended, but the sovereign had made his position unequivocally clear, proving that the survival and authority of the throne would always supersede blood, memory, and personal loyalty. At 3 o'clock in the morning, the sovereign executive machine executed a lightning-fast purge of the National Archives. Within 90 minutes, every official designation, honorary advisory role, and legacy clearance pass belonging to Earl Spencer was systematically scrubbed from the government registry database. Across the capital, senior IT administrators working under emergency clearance codes severed the Earl digital credentials, rendering his statutory influence obsolete before the sun could rise over London. Simultaneously, the Kensington Palace Communications Division erected an impenetrable media firewall around the incident. Press officers immediately dispatched synchronized briefing packets to major news outlets across the globe, framing the late-night activity at Windsor Castle as nothing more than a routine, scheduled inventory audit of the Royal Collection Trust. The carefully crafted narrative contained no mention of shouting, no mention of fallen tiaras, and no mention of frozen trust funds, effectively neutralizing any potential public scandal before it could gain traction. As thick river fog rolled across the grounds at 5 o'clock in the morning, two men met in absolute secrecy beneath the shadow of the Round Tower. Prince William stood waiting, his hands buried deep in his dark wool coat, his eyes cold and unreadable as Earl Spencer approached through the mist. The emotional agony that had broken the young prince hours earlier in the map room had completely vanished, replaced by an unyielding composure that signaled the arrival of a new, formidable force within the dynasty. The Prince of Wales delivered a cold, non-negotiable legal verdict to his uncle, without a single trace of sentimentality. William demanded that Earl Spencer immediately withdraw every pending lawsuit, sign a complete waiver of legal claims against the estate, and surrender his public campaign regarding the Princess Diana Trust. In direct exchange for absolute compliance, William pledged to exercise his own constitutional leverage over King Charles, forcing the sovereign to permanently unmount the Koh-i-Noor diamond from the Queen Consort tiara and lock the stone away inside an independent protective trust created exclusively for Princess Charlotte. It was a ruthless, masterfully calculated political settlement designed to solve a 30-year feud in a single stroke. By stripping the diamond away from Queen Camilla while simultaneously withholding it from the Spencer family, William positioned himself as the ultimate arbiter of the monarchy, boldly asserting his political authority over both his father and his uncle. Earl Spencer stared at his nephew in profound shock, realizing that the grieving boy who had once walked behind Diana's coffin had transformed into an uncompromising strategist who put the survival of the crown above family affection. With a heavy, bitter sigh, Earl Spencer pulled a silver fountain pen from his pocket and signed the non-disclosure agreement on the stone parapet, watching the wet ink dry in the freezing morning air. The ancient dispute over Princess Diana's legacy had finally come to a close, not through royal decrees or public courtroom battles, but through the sharp, cold pragmatism of the future king. As the first pale rays of dawn broke over the stone battlements of Windsor Castle, Earl Spencer quietly felt the full, crushing weight of his defeat. He walked slowly across the deserted cobblestone courtyard, his footsteps echoing against the damp walls in absolute silence. No royal attendants rushed forward to open his door, no guards saluted his departure, and no family members stood at the gates to bid him farewell. Stepping into the back seat of his waiting black sedan, the Earl watched the massive iron gates swing shut behind him, closing off the world he had fought so desperately to challenge. The decades of legal battles, personal sacrifices, and fierce defense of his sister memory had culminated in a silent exit into the morning mist, leaving him cast out from the inner circle of power forever. Deep inside the darkened private study, King Charles III sat entirely alone in a high-backed leather chair. The majestic roar of royal authority had completely faded, leaving behind a frail, exhausted man sitting in the shadows. His weathered hands trembled slightly as his thumb slowly traced the silver frame of an old, faded photograph resting on his desk. The portrait showed a younger, smiling family before the decades of public scandals, painful divorces, and bitter court feuds had torn them apart. The sovereign had successfully defended the supreme dignity of the crown and asserted his absolute legal authority, yet the quiet room offered no warmth or victory. He had learned the ultimate, unyielding truth of the monarchy, realizing that the absolute price of holding supreme power is a cold, suffocating solitude that no royal title can ever warm. High above the estate grounds, on the wind-swept balcony of the Round Tower, Prince William stood watching the dark car vanish down the long avenue. The cold morning air bit at his face as he reached up with a steady hand to wipe away a final, solitary tear. He took a deep, deliberate breath, squaring his shoulders and fixing his gaze on the distant horizon. In that quiet moment above the castle, the grieving sun fully dissolved, allowing the impenetrable armor of a future king to take his place. He accepted the painful reality that leading a nation requires a heart of stone, understanding that personal affection must always be sacrificed to protect the continuity of the realm. The ancient stone walls of Windsor Castle remained standing tall and unbroken against the gathering storms, just as they had survived centuries of war, rebellion, and political turmoil. Yet beneath the impressive facade of royal majesty, the deep emotional fractures within the family remained permanent. No constitutional decree, no emergency order, and no official press statement could ever repair the trust that had been burned away in the subterranean vault. Deep within the fortress vaults, the legendary Koh-i-Noor diamond lay completely silent inside a reinforced, sealed safe protected by high-security digital locks and state legal trusts. The contested stone sat in the dark, waiting for the distant day when Princess Charlotte would come of age to officially claim the sacred inheritance of her late grandmother. A tempestuous night at Windsor Castle came to an abrupt close with a ruthless, freezing decree from King Charles III, the bitter retreat of Earl Spencer, and a tearful yet masterful power settlement orchestrated by Prince William to protect Princess Charlotte's inheritance. Did the cold, unwavering resolve displayed by the Prince of Wales last night prove that he is fully prepared to inherit the throne, or does it signal that he is becoming increasingly rigid and solitary, walking the exact same path as his father? If you appreciate deep analytical stories uncovering behind-the-scenes drama and royal power struggles, be sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notification alerts right now so you never miss the next shocking video.